Well, let's take a look at how mythology has brought us a lot of our modern movies that we have today. A lot of contemporary movies are built on it, and it's just not the comic book ones that we are all familiar with, like Wonder Woman here, which people believe is based on a comic book, but it actually is based upon something much earlier and a few legends intertwined, and that comes from something even earlier. We'll look into that here as we go. Let's look at 9 different movies that are contemporary that have mythological origins, or they're based on ancient myths and legends. Since the beginning of movie making at the end of the 1880s, films have touched on plethora of mythological themes. From the 1970s classic The Asphyx to the action-packed Wonder Woman, we've brought together some of our favorite mythological movies for your viewing pleasure. Although there are movies about Frankenstein and Dracula and things all the way back in silent movies and so on, and a lot of those are built on mythology too. Let's look at these that are somewhat contemporary. Here's the Asphyx. Was trying to bottle up the spirit of death, or when somebody dies. Ever since the Victorian era, humankind has been fascinated with the idea of death and the existence of the soul. I would say that that's an incorrect statement. Ever since the dawn of man, we've been fascinated with the idea of death and have come up with the existence of a soul. And that goes way back before the Victorian era very far. There was a resurgence during that time with photography and seances and all kinds of things through the Victorian era, though. Scholars and scientists of the time attempted to conduct experiments, taking post-mortem photographs or images of people on their deathbeds, so much so that it was a popular pastime, was attempting to capture photos of the soul leaving the body in an attempt to prove its existence. One thing that they did in a more modern time than this by far was having weighed somebody who was still alive and then he passed away. And then they weighed him for his death and he weighed a few ounces less. And they're saying the circulation of the blood and movement in there actually counts for a slight bit of weight there, but it also has been commended as being the weight of a soul. The 1970s movie, The Asphyx, starts from this premise. It's in this classic British horror film directed by Peter Newbrook and set in Victorian England. The researcher Sir Hugo Cunningham takes a photograph which seems to capture the image of something floating right above the subject's body at the time of death. Initially believing that this might be proof of supporting the existence of the soul, after closer examination, the scientist concludes that the shape wasn't actually leaving the body, but rather coming towards it. Dun, 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 dun. Throughout history, many have pondered the questions of whether there is just one death or a death for each individual. In this mythological movie, Cunningham discovers that the ancient Greeks had their own theory, the belief that there existed a death for each person called an asphyx. This was the shadow of your former self, very much like the Ka and Ba statues and concepts of a shadow of a person that the Egyptians kind of had. Also, you notice that asphyx has to do with asphyxiation. And this thing was supposed to have stole your last breath to where you couldn't breathe again, and that was the end of it, like when you get the air knocked out of you. This concept, asphyxiation. It also closely matches the Sphinx, which has to do with sphincter, which is the closing of your throat or your anus, or we have quite a few in our bodies actually. This so-called asphyx was a tormented being, a dementor, created at the time of a person's birth. Their alter ego, their twin in the alternate reality, only to be set free at their death, severing ties between the body and the soul. Cunningham goes on to attempt to capture and trap this asphyx, or his asphyx, to bottle it, as so to speak, believing that he has discovered a way to achieve immortality. You see, if you just kill your own death, or keep it from being able to get to you, death never comes for you. And it's a concept going way back to the Grim Reaper and all of that goes along with it. But funny how to mind comes Ghostbusters and how they're trying to trap these things in these more modern day little portals. For if the asphyx is unable to re-enter a body, then they would never be able to die. Could live on forever. Could this be the way that vampires are made somehow, or liches and things like that in olden days? You see, they had this idea of trapping someone's soul in a concept into gemstones and all kinds of things. Genies are actually built on this concept, but I believe we're going to talk about that here shortly too. Trapped within objects. People say something's haunted, whether it's a doll or some keepsake that people used to have long ago. What do you think about that? Troy, the 2004 movie, bringing the legendary Trojan War to the big screen. This epic blockbuster movie, Troy, tells a story about a legendary Trojan War. While this is assumed by most to be based on a true story, these days historians wonder if the Trojan War actually ever took place. Although it's described in riveting detail in Homer's Iliad, a work of literary genius which captures timeless truths about the savagery of war, there is still no real proof for Homer's Trojan War. Interestingly, just the other day I watched a video and I thought about trying to make a video on this concept where someone has figured out that the ancient Hattusha and Hittites that were there have a tale where in between them and Anatolia, just before the Bronze Age collapse had happened, had one of the factions, which was over in the more western area, had taken captives. And then there was a disagreement, something happened, and they don't really know what happened after that. What was the answer to that happened? Did they war on them? They war on them. But this looks like these people, the Hittites, are talking about the Trojan War before it ever happened. And they also correlate this incredible walled fortress, which we've also shown before in the Hittites, which looked very much like a modern, or what we would think of as a medieval castle, which would be much more modern than its time. But I've also shown you a place in Egypt, way up the Nile near Nubia, that they kept as a fortress area just recently that I could have done Where Are We At? And I'm not sure anybody would have ever gotten Egypt for a good long time there. There's a little bit of difference going along with that, but that shows that it's believed that something like that happened, but it doesn't necessarily involve the woman that it did before, but it could have involved a woman who was actually a princess before that was given between the two of them as a partnership, if you will, like people used to do back then, and then something went awry from that. At the center of this mythological movie is the character Helen of Troy, played by Diane Kruger. In Greek mythology, Helen was the daughter of Leda, or Leto, tricked into copulating with the god Zeus, disguised as a swan, which also has symbology in it, said to be the most beautiful woman in the world. Once again, the gods intervened by promising Helen to the Trojan prince Paris in exchange for choosing Aphrodite as the most beautiful of the gods. The wife of Menelaus, Helen, is taken by Paris back to Troy, kicking off the whole messy affair, the wrath of the Spartans and the supposed Trojan War. The mythological movie covers all the basis and complex relationships of the original story of ancient Troy. Brad Pitt plays Achilles quite well if you've watched it, and give him a chance. Orlando Bloom, the part of the Trojan Prince Paris. Eric Bana, the Trojan Prince, and the warrior Hector, and Rose Cern is Briseis, the virgin priestess of Apollo, given as a war prize to Achilles, only to be taken by Agamemnon. Although a pretty loose adaptation of the Iliad, it does bring the 3,000-year-old story to life through stunning combat sequences with a little Hollywood sparkle. Well, they always have that in movies, it's got to be a little bit over-embellished. They seem to feel like the natural thing's not good enough, it has to go. Many believe the Trojan War actually happened, but just not to the effect that was embellished later, and that was in a way meant to keep somehow the people of the area of Anatolia that used to be there and their gods. For Apollo actually comes from there. So the things that go along with that you hear might be a little bit more revealed whenever you understand that. Looking at genies, pre-Islamic Arab mythology speaks of the existence of supernatural spirits known as jinn or genies. If you're of my age or anywhere near it, you probably remember I Dream of Genie and how that worked out with the Genie of the Lamp, which was played by the beautiful Barbara Eden. It's a little different, though, than the original thought that's there, which is a little more scary and so on. These days, the jinn have been reduced to the Disney-like image of a colorful genie, which has the connection to blue. They're beings trapped within a lamp and being obligated to grant wishes, but originally legend had it that they were beings not just worthy of respect, but also able to provoke immense fear due to their ability to cause mental illness and even disease. This is like the spirits that they believe that caused illness and so on in the Sumerians, a lot of other people. They knew it somehow was on the wind too, but they couldn't see it. It was far too small to see. And so this led to a bunch of odd ideas that they had to do with disease, and that would be the thing that passed back and forth, or you wouldn't see it. There's also a connection to a people that at one time brought disease to another people, and it caused a problem, but probably shouldn't get into that necessarily right here. While the jinn could be good, evil, or neutral, the devil is considered to have been originated from the ranks of the jinn. A lot of people don't understand the concept, and even the devil and all that. Really, the concept was supposed to have been an idea of that there were a series of good gods, and then there was a series of bad gods. But they weren't really bad gods, they were just the gods of the afterlife. But because something bad happened and it took you to the afterlife, there's all that type of connections. And then, of course, it's been drawn out, spawned quite a bit to be the form that we got into with a point of the Bible. I think as humanity, we're so far past this point in a lot of these beliefs, yet there are still a lot of people still having some of these primitive type beliefs, or going along with the idea, even in the face of modern medicine. So it does seem kind of odd, but then again, to them, that modern medicine is some type of magic caught inside a little pill. Ancient mythology considered that the jinn were able to take shelter inside of all sorts of old objects, usually ancient though, not just limited to lamps, including precious stones and especially opals. If you ever looked into an opal and you see that transfigured little prisms in there, it looks like dimensions caught in between it. In the mythological movie series Wishmaster, the djinn starts out trapped inside a red opal, and the movie begins with the following words: "Once, in a time before time, God breathed life into the universe, and the light gave birth to angels, and the earth gave birth to man, and the fire gave birth to the jinn, creatures condemned to dwell in the void between the worlds. One who walks a jinn will be given 3 wishes. Upon the granting of the third, the unholy legions of the jinn will be freed to rule this earth. Fear one thing only in all there is. Fear the jinn." I remember seeing that whenever I was a kid, being a little bit disappointed on some of the effects that they had going on. There's a lot of movies that they redo nowadays and stuff. This is probably one of them that really would have benefited by modern CGI techniques. We're right now just on the edge of making something look a lot more real than say that it was 20 years ago or more. If you look at that idea that sun lights up, gives birth to angels and stars, so the stars lit up from that and all this, but out of the fire becomes the jinn. It was directed by Robert Kurtzman, and these fantasy horror movies are set in a modern-day North America, where an ancient, and in this case demonic, jinn is freed from the opal. In these mythological movies, the jinn is depicted as an evil genie who, once freed, starts a twisted and deadly rampage, creating curses out of the innocent human wishes in the hopes of garnering 3 wishes needed to be able to summon his brethren to take over Earth. Kind of a strange story there, but of course a lot of these had this idea that the people just didn't know. Somehow he picked up a lamp and it had a scuff on it and he rubbed it and poof, that type of thing. That they weren't searching for it in the first place. There's a lot of old tales with genies that I could go into that show you a myriad of different types of ideas, and none of them really were a giggly guy like Robin Williams, though he did a fantastic job of how you would maybe portray something and twist it all the way down to a cartoon form. These weren't supposed to be cartoon creatures. These are creatures that cause death, problems, as it's just stated. So, hey, but then again, they're meant to be somewhat scary. That wasn't really shown either, was it? Remember Nightmare on Elm Street with Freddy Krueger? This guy that had Edward Scissorhands before Edward Scissorhands? Yeah, it all started out because somehow there was this bad guy and they had put him in a furnace and burned him alive, but his ghost was still there. And then he started invading nightmares. There was a lot of movies about nightmares and things too at this same time, along with a lot of other things too, like Gremlins and so on. Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984 to 2003. Yeah, they were one of those franchises like Friday the 13th and so on that had probably far too many of them. So they say he's the incarnation of the god of nightmares in a way, based on the premise that dreams can mirror reality or vice versa, or if you die in your dream, you'll die. A Nightmare on Elm Street is probably the most successful horror franchise of all time. Created by Wes Craven, in these films, fear is personified as Freddy Krueger, a modern-day incarnation of an entity which has existed since the beginning of time, the god of fear and nightmares. Fear personified as an entity exists in an ancient mythology from every corner of the planet, such as the boogeyman from the west and the god Phobos of the ancient Greeks, and his Roman equivalent Timor. In fact, the term Phobos itself means fear, where you think you have a phobia, which people are crazy about talking about now as if you had a real fear of something, and it's not necessarily a fear in a lot of these cases, so it's not even a correct term. It's a disgust, and that's totally different. Then, of course, there's Timur, and that lives the idea of timidness and so on. But Phobos is used to be worshipped by heroes and warriors, including Agamemnon and Hercules, who had images depicting him on their shields, and bloody sacrifices were performed in his name, this god of fear. He was invoked a few times, one famous one. Even Alexander the Great dedicated sacrifice to this god before the Battle of Gaugamela, asking that his enemy, Darius the Great, would be overwhelmed by fear, and as a result, it must have happened, Darius fled the battlefield, leaving Alexander the Great triumphant. Fear has fascinated and terrified humankind throughout the ages, so it isn't all that surprising that a character personifying fear itself, Freddy Krueger, has obsessed mythological movie audiences for decades. And when I was a kid, some of it was pretty scary. Some of it was kind of comical, and I think it was meant to be that way at a point. Some of it seemed to be shot pretty well, some of it not so much. We all like the Friday 13th movies and the Halloween movies too, and I'll never forget something like that. Wonder Woman, the princess of the Amazons, fighting to protect humanity. That's the way it's kind of portrayed here, and of course it was done so in the comic books. Starring Gal Gadot, the 2017 Wonder Woman adaptation was created by DC Films, put simply, when the film follows Diana Prince, a Louvre art historian, Amazon princess who sets out to stop World War I. Her quest begins after a pilot crashes into the island nation of Themyscira, the shifting female utopia of the Amazonians, which is protected from the outside world by a magical fog. The aim of the movie is to establish the background and motivations of the comic book character Wonder Woman. Well, the Amazonians are actually two different places, and I've done videos about this in the past. We all know about the Scythian warriors and how there were sects of those that had women that were warriors as part of their ideal too. In fact, you couldn't actually be a married woman until you had killed 3 of your adversaries for one of these groups at one point when they were high at war. And been burials shown where they actually thought it was a man here that's buried because there are weapons and everything with it, realizing that she's a warrior princess. So these weren't women that were just going to stand by and scream and get taken away. In fact, after you dealt with all the men, you had to deal with the women that were left. So there wasn't much of that, or much fun in that too. Another version of the Amazons are the Amazai, the endemic North African Berbers that are there, and there's still pockets of men, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, red-haired, so on, that are mixed in there. And the Amazons from there are the Amazai, as has been taken. They call them Berbers, but that's somewhat derogatory. Also, we know of the Amazon River, but that's because whenever we first went traversing up it, they were attacked by a bunch of women at one time, and so they called it that and recreated that Amazon River. And of course, taking mythology, and there's a lot of places that you can simply see, like New York and York, New Hampshire and Hampshire, but then you can also see where things are recreated, where down the Nile, down towards the Delta, there was Memphis, and here in our great Mississippi River we have that same Memphis down near the Delta. Also things like Brazil, whenever High Brazil used to be a mythical land that was over near Ireland and so on in past, and then now Brazil is a place, well, it was a place where the first Irish slaves went to too, but we don't need to get into that. Historians believe that the Amazons of Greek mythology were a close society of women, or necessarily a women alone, or that a lot of time they're shown that way, and that's not necessarily true. They were women of enormous physical strength. They were mentioned in ancient literature such as the Iliad and the Argonautica. Greek historian Herodotus wrote of the Amazons as a tribe of fierce warrior women, now believed to have been the descendants of the nomadic ancient Scythians and Sarmatian people, according to archaeological discoveries of female warrior burials. In the movie version, Diana is daughter of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, and niece to Antiope, played by spectacular Robin Wright. A lot of you will remember is Forrest Gump's Genie, who trained Diana as a warrior. When she finds out about the Great War, Diana abandons the island to stop Ares, who has plotted to cause the downfall of humanity in World War I. After she kills him, she continues to fight for good from then on as Wonder Woman. But here we have another connection too, for whenever they give you the name Diana, this is the ancient goddess of love who became the goddess of war, opposing Ares. So this is exactly what this is. And this is from Anna, or Inanna, of the Sumerians. Diana is Dios Anna, like Jupiter is Dios Pater. And therefore, what we're looking at is an idea of a god of war being attacked by a goddess of war, or a people that had a goddess of war. And these are ancient fights that had happened long before the recorded history in these Scythian type peoples and so on, and their women were not to be taken just lightly. Let's move on though. Hellraiser, the Gateway to Hell, the first in a seemingly never-ending franchise of movies. The 1987 film revolves around a magical puzzle box, supposedly created by a French toy maker known as Philippe Lamarchand and named the Lament configuration. This outwardly innocuous puzzle box has the ability to open up a gateway to Barker's version of Hell, the world of the Cenobites. The Cenobite demons were once humans transformed in their quest for physical gratification. Once the box's gateway is open, the Cenobites harvest the souls of unwitting victims, and Hellraiser, the character Frank Houghton, attempts to escape the Cenobite realm, where the blood of his brother reopens the gateway and tries to regenerate his own body with the blood of other victims. Medieval legends talked about gateways to hell, also known as Hell Mouse. While similar concepts have been recorded throughout Asia as well as in Hawaiian, Central American mythology, even European, based on Clive Barker's 1986 novel, The Hellbound Heart, Hellraiser, the movie, is a modern-day take on ancient legends discussing these mythological concepts, but it's also in some way somebody be able to open up a wormhole effectively to the afterlife, or open it up, and you don't want to go messing with it because it could be hell, which they strangely show Satan as being this extremely pale guy with pins all stuck in him in a configuration all over his body. How about Coco? You wouldn't think there'd be much to that and everything, but hey, kind of like it. It's one of the only movies where they show guitar playing, where whenever you see him do it, it looks like somebody actually playing a guitar. They actually went through the trouble of doing that, finally. Whereas usually you see them just fumbling around and on the wrong area of the neck and everything and just couldn't be doing it. It's just something people who can play guitar kind of pick at or whatever when they see in a movie. It's like, you could. Disney and Pixar joined forces in 2017 to make what New York Times described as a family-friendly cartoon about death. Using colorful and magical graphics, it manages to share culture and beliefs of the Mexican Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead, through the story of Miguel, a young boy who dreams of being a famous musician, and takes viewers on a marvelous journey into the land of the dead. It correlates also to the exact same time as Halloween, and they had it before Halloween. I've done a special on this, showing you that there's a connection with ancient people all to the same time, even in the Bible, in this All Saints Day, which is All Hallows Eve, where we get the concept from, or the name actually. But that cooks up probably, it seems, to Younger Dryas event, and whether it happened at the same time or because we see all these meteors or falling stars at that time correlated to a time whenever this happened, called witches' brooms and so on. Coco even presents its young audience with the concept of the Zoloquetlinen, the hairless dogs who guided the souls of the dead through the underworld. It's a marvelous feat indeed that a film about death and skeletons can make you feel quite so warm and well fuzzy. The importance of family, both living and dead, and ancestral history comes to the fore in this memorable PG production. Well, it's just a way of looking at death, and now realizing what religion really had a concept of. It might be better if we tried to look at things a little bit more in this light than the other ways that we try to look at it. Because it exists, and rather than to live your whole life a freaky lie, maybe we ought to come up with something better that people can understand and work with. Sorry it keeps reloading on me, but we'll get there in just a second. A lot of mythological concepts in movies, and really we could do one about quite a few different ones. Hell, you could probably name some down in the comments and we could go off on them. You give me 5 or 6 and we'll do this again with different ones, and I'll be able to just go off the cuff and look at different pictures of the movie and maybe small clips if they don't flag it. How about the story of leprechauns, or even Hellboy in the Golden Army, representing mythical elementals? Elementals were powerful type creatures. Ever since antiquity, the mythical elementals have been associated with the elements of nature. From salamanders and undines to elves and gnomes, in modern times elementals have been reduced to absurd and comical images like those of Santa's elves. However, in the past they were highly feared beings whose existence was not subject to human concept of morality and conscience, and who considered humans as inferior. In fact, legends place elementals between the gods but above humans. In a way, people looked at this as something to strive to try to be more like. This is kind of a concept of seeing Spock and trying to be a little bit more Spock. If you're looking to explore the original legendary concepts of the elementals, it's worth watching both the Leprechaun horror series and Guillermo del Toro's film Hellboy 2, The Golden Army. In fact, Hellboy 2 is based on a very old myth which talks about the Gnome King, Matthias, who is said to sit on his throne, albeit asleep, in a giant subterranean room hidden somewhere deep inside Earth along with his army. Legend has it that whenever the time comes, a chosen one will be unsheathed the sleeping king's sword, thus waking him up along with his long-dead army and therefore obtaining the chance to change the world. We saw something like this in the Lord of the Rings, where there were people kind of somewhat trapped and had to get out of that. But this army of the dead has been seen in a lot of movies. Child's play exporting concept of voodoo. Throughout history, African diasporic voodoo has fascinated and terrified, inspired and scared. The 1988 movie Child's Play tells the story of a serial killer who transfers his soul into the body of a puppet doll by invoking Damballa, one of the primary voodoo Io spirits, known as the spirit of the sky and creator of life. Association with snakes in Haiti and the New Orleans, Damballa is also depicted in snake form. But then again, we have that same concept of a genie or something being trapped inside that. And then if something's done to that, that would be done to them themselves. Effectively, like if you make a voodoo doll and you poke it, then that person will have back pain or whatever you have along with it idea. Created by Don Mancini, it's inspired a franchise of sequels, some of which were box office sensations, others not so much. Since he first appeared on the big screen, Chucky, the possessed voodoo doll, which no sane parent would ever buy for their child, by the way, has become a horror movie icon known for comic and unforgettable one-liners such as, "Hi, I'm Chucky, want to play?" Or, you can't keep a good guy down." Yeah, I never really thought that it was that fantastic either, but it's also that scare of dolls. Like in Poltergeist, whenever the clown doll gets a hold of the kid or so on. See, Poltergeist would be a good one to really go off on, and the concepts that go along with that, than just some marionette or type of mannequin puppet that goes off. Oh, Mannequin could be a movie to talk about. For there's an ancient story of a statue coming to life and a man falling in love with a statue. And in fact, there are stories of the Greeks falling in love with statues because they had made the statue so beautiful. They were irresistibly gorgeous, just incredible. You've seen some of them, I'm sure. So that's just a look at some of the different movies that we have. 9 of them we've been able to look through, but somehow it feels like it was only about 6. But talking about mythological setups that are all done in this. Peace.